Hello, everyone. It is just after 3, so I think we're going to get started. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome everyone to the 2023 Distinguished Lecture in Economics. My name is Anna Esselment, and I am the Associate Dean of Graduate Studies in the Faculty of Arts. I am honored to bring greetings on behalf of the Dean of Arts, Sheila Ager, who was very disappointed that she was not able to join us here today. But her loss is definitely my gain because I get to be here today. I'd like to start us off with our university territorial acknowledgement. The University of Waterloo acknowledges that much of our work takes place on the traditional territory of the neutral, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. Our main campus is situated on the Haldimand Tract, the land granted to the Six Nations that includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. Our active work toward reconciliation takes place across our campuses through research, learning, teaching, and community building, and is coordinated within the Office of Indigenous Relations. There are also a few thank yous that I would like to extend. First, to our highly respected Department of Economics for organizing today's distinguished lecture, which is truly one of the highlights of our calendar year. In particular, I would like to thank the organizing committee, Francisco Gonzalez, who is, where are you? I'm just gonna make them, there's Francisco over there, Margaret Inslee, and Sherry Ann Arsenault. Where's Sherry Ann? She's probably running around in the back, still organizing. As well as everyone else who helped make today's event such a tremendous success. I think it goes without saying, although I'm going to say it anyway, that events like this are terrifically important to the Faculty of Arts. They go a long way to enhance student learning, to provide an engaging academic experience, and to support our mission of helping students achieve their highest potential. And it's so great to see so many of our students here today who are taking part in today's lecture. The lecture would not be possible without the generous support of our alumni, and so I would like to give a special thanks and recognition to Jolion Burton, who is the co-founder, president, and head of investment banking at Bloom Burton and Company. Yes. I was going to do another round of applause too. You might get a few rounds here, Jolion. For the students in the room, Jolion is a proud alumnus of the Department of Economics, and we are sincerely appreciative to him for sponsoring today's lecture. Please join me again in thanking Jolion for his generous support. And it's at this time that it gives me great pleasure to invite Jolion to the stage to bring greetings on behalf of Bloom Burton and Company.
Thank you very kindly. Professor Esselment, those were very kind words, unnecessary, but thank you, appreciate that. Bloom Burton & Co. is Canada's only healthcare-focused investment bank, and so we're quite active in the world of innovation and discovery and paying attention to what's going on in academic settings like the ones at University of Waterloo are great. I graduated in 2000. I've been back since then, but it's wonderful to be back here, and thank you all for arranging this July beautiful weather. It's not September, is it? No. This is such an interesting and important thing for a firm like mine, Bloom Burton & Co., to sponsor. You know, the world is much more than anything one does in their daily lives, and we love that the University of Waterloo and the Department of Economics have organized such a wonderful and enriching discussion we're about to have. And we're grateful for that opportunity to participate in and support that you might have a more enriched day, perhaps a more enriched life from the thoughts you get, and engage in discussion and elevate the thinking. For the opportunity for that, I say thank you. So I don't need to thank you. I want to say thank you for being you and coming out to support this and being part of this. That's what's more important in life than anything. And in the end, I'll simply say a big thank you for all of this and letting Bloom Burton be a part of it, and for me too, and to be back on campus. And ultimately, we need to now get to the main event. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Professor Kate Rybczynski, who will do the introduction of the key speaker. Thanks, everyone.
So I'll say another welcome, everyone. So glad you could all join today. And I am delighted to introduce you to our speaker, Dr. Rohini Pande, who is Director of the Economic Growth Center, Director of Inclusion Economics, and Henry J. Hines II Professor of Economics at Yale University. She is also co-editor of American Economic Review Insights, Fellow of the Econometric Society, Laureate of the Infosys Prize in Social Sciences and the Carolyn Shaw Bell Award, and much more. Dr. Pande's research addresses critically important issues, not just in terms of methodology, but also for human well-being. Her research informs policy that benefits both individual and global development. Her influential work spans issues in gender inequality, class and caste inequalities, poverty, health, and environmental concerns. She, along with fantastic co-authors, shows us how depositing wages into a woman's own account rather than joint family accounts and teaching her how to use it increases women's labor market participation in rural India. How policymakers can improve incentives to stop crop burning by providing partial payment up front rather than full payment at the end of the crop cycle, as advance payment can reduce both distrust and liquidity constraints. Dr. Pande reminds us to consider incentives, who benefits and how, because if we can identify these, we can then design policy that is more effective in bringing about change. Importantly, she shows us how these issues are critically interconnected, as are research and advocacy. In addition to her research contributions, Dr. Pande is recognized for her incredible mentorship and for her leadership both by example and by encouragement to stand up and speak up for women in economics. She lends both her time and her cachet to promote the balance that is so integral to high-quality intellectual exchange. For me, Dr. Pande is an inspiration, but her recent research has also delighted me on a personal level because it shed light on a little mystery from my grandmother's diary. Granny was studying in London in 1937 and went to visit friends in Cambridge. She said Cambridge was beautiful, but she wouldn't want to study there because they simply hate girls going there and won't have a thing to do with them. A quick web search could tell me that Cambridge didn't admit women to degrees until 1948, but Dr. Pande delved into why it took so long. She and her co-author illustrate how institutional structures, because they are shaped by people and reflect our perceived ideals, can reinforce prevalent norms, generating persistent inequalities. That, and economist Alfred Marshall didn't want to compete with his wife. The issues that Dr. Pande tackles don't just represent glass ceilings and walls, but sheer cliffs of global inequality, giant and daunting in their scope. But Dr. Pande is scaling these cliffs and shining light for others to lead. What we do with our energy not only shapes who we are, but also changes the world around us. Dr. Pande's work inspires me, and I hope you enjoy the same. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Pande.
Thank you so much, Kate. That was an incredibly generous introduction and way more than anything I deserved. And more broadly, thank you very much for inviting me to campus today. It's a real honor to be here, and I apologize for keeping you away from the lovely weather outside. Although I think some of what I'm going to talk about is why we should be slightly worried about this weather right now. So before I jump into the talk, let me just kind of put a little bit of, substance behind the 4 words on the title. And of course, the starting point of this talk is really to try to think about, as economists, how should we think about policies to address climate breakdown? A lot of the attention that we see in the world is either right now on the legal front, so a lot of lawyers getting together at, say, the Paris or Kyoto or other than trying to come up in international climate arrangements, or we see a lot of work on the science front of trying to understand, how can we have renewables that are cheaper, does geoengineering work? These are both incredibly important tools in our arsenal. But I think sometimes what gets missed is the fact that you'll have to implement these. You'll have to implement the legal structures that are put in place, and you're going to have to put in place these technologies. And that comes back in a lot of ways to what Kate was talking about, which is incentives. When our country is going to have incentives to adopt these technologies, when are individuals going to have incentives to follow regulation and regulators to follow, to put in place? And that, I'm going to argue, is, of course, at the heart of it is the fact that when you have something like a greenhouse gas, or even more broadly, pollution, it's a good that has externalities. So a market will not actually price those externalities itself, so you will not see the social cost being reflected. This directly creates a role for the state as a regulator. We all recognize this, but we also know from just reading newspapers and looking around us that what the state is able to do really depends on whether it can create political consensus around it. We're all proud to live in democracies, but we also recognize one feature of a democracy is you have to create consensus. And often that's particularly hard in societies that are seeing rising economic inequality. And so I think underlying the entire talk is really the idea that a lot of what we're seeing with our ability or inability to put in place policies around the climate crisis has to do with how well we're able to think about economic inequality and the incentives it provides both individuals and the political system to respond to it. I'm not going to offer a solution. I'm not going to be able to say, this is what we can do to get to political consensus. I just want to lay out some of the facts. I'm going to start with some of the facts of what we are seeing, talk about why we want to go beyond what we think of as free markets, and then I want to draw on some of my work, which has not to do with carbon or greenhouse gases, but rather has to do with thinking about air pollution in India. And I want to argue that some of the issues that we see there in terms of how regulators have or haven't managed to bring these down in a context of a society that sees economic development as incredibly important are going to be translatable to thinking about policies to address the climate breakdown. And then I want to conclude with some thoughts on what could possibly work on a climate breakdown, and of course leave open the question at the end of what does it mean for the politics of it, which I think remains the central issue. So let me start by just giving you some basic facts to set stage on what do we see when we think about the links between economic development, emissions, and climate. So this is just a reminder that the world over, economic development remains incredibly carbon intensive. Development requires energy. I think no one would doubt that. We've also seen a huge rise in the last few years, especially, of renewables, and the prices have come down a lot. But I think if you looked at the change in renewables, you'd be very positive. But then if you just look at the absolute levels and you see how much of it is carbon-based, it's still very high. Of course, it's higher in kind of growing economies right now, but it remains high across the world. And that at the heart is one of the deep challenges we face. Importantly, when we think about some aspects of what we may think of as public bads on inequality, it could be pollution, it could be economic inequality, there's often a hope that as you get richer, policies will just automatically kick in because citizens demand it, which will improve matters. Air pollution is a classic example. People will give examples of, London in the 1950s or other parts of the world that were very dirty and have become incredibly clean more recently. And often this is called kind of the environmental Kuznets curve. In contrast, we know there is no evidence of an emissions Kuznets curve. Rich countries rely as much on energy for their economic development as poor countries. We are seeing no evidence in the data that this is declining. You can see that more clearly here if you ask, how does the energy trajectory of a country change as it gets richer? So the light squares are countries that in 1960 were at comparable levels of income as, say, to many of today's lower income countries, richer but still about to grow. And you see there, the path we see across GDP for these countries is similar to what we are seeing in 2006 for lower developed countries. So the trajectory has not changed much. You can update that with data for 2020, and it'll look very similar. So that's sort of just setting the stage of energy use. So energy use the world over is high. It could be if you're trying to develop, you're aiming to stay rich and not have degrowth, you're going to see high energy use, and most of it still comes from fossil fuel. At the same time, once we start thinking about the costs of this, we know that one of the key effects of greenhouse gas emissions is global warming. And now how it affects a country really depends, in some sense, on the base of where you start from. And it happens to be the case that many of the world's poorest countries are near the tropics or are in relatively warm places. So as you increase warming, you're going to increase income inequality across countries just through that narrow lens, because countries, say, in the north of Canada may become better for farming, but if you're in the Sahel and Africa, you're basically going to lose essentially whatever little ability you had to do agriculture in your country. What I think is sometimes less considered is also what is happening within countries. We often understand less the fact that within countries, we've seen over the last 2 decades a large increase in wealth inequality. And what this wealth inequality is also being mirrored in is an increase in carbon dioxide inequality. So a billionaire in India is as likely to use a private jet as a billionaire in the US, and both of them are going to affect emissions more than their poor counterpart. So very often when people talk at the level of the country and they say, oh, in India, India is going to become a country where a lot of emissions are going to come from, we have to be kind of careful to distinguish where in the country they're going to come from, where in the income distribution they're going to come from. The poor farmer is still going to have a very narrow footprint or absent footprint, while the rich billionaire in Mumbai is going to have a very big footprint. But a government has to take both of them along in some way or decide who they care about. And I think this rising emission inequality within countries that very much matches wealth inequality is one of the big political challenges that governments face in thinking how to deal with it. And as I said, that again, it's not just there's emissions inequality, but this is just a set of newspaper headlines coming from India, from Ghana, and even from Chicago in 1995 that reminds us that when we have large heat waves, the groups that suffer are the poor, both in terms of lower productivity, the fact that agricultural yields fall, and then purely just directly from mortality. All of these are going to hit more the poor, who often have less political clout. So if we think there is emissions inequality and the weight of the impact is going to fall more on poor households, they're often the ones who are going to have less ability to move the political system in their country, even though they bear more of the cost. So that's, I guess, a bit of a downer. But let me now move to just talking a little bit about some of the economics. Why should we need to go beyond free markets in this case? And why is it actually also hard? So as I mentioned at the start, I think a key feature to think about is very often when we think of I've put free in quotes for a reason that you'll see in the next bullet point, but when we think of what we think of free markets, what perhaps we still teach sometimes in our first lectures in Microeconomics 101, is that there are supply and demand curves. They're defined by how much is being produced on the supply side and how much is being demanded, and their intersection defines this market clearing price. And we like to think that this market in some ways can yield outcomes that are possibly efficient. But this breaks down, and Coase and others pointed this out a long time ago. When you have a production activity of individual A that affects the well-being of individual B, C, and D, but they do not undertake the benefit of it. So in this case, the private cost and the social cost is going to differ, and it's going to differ by externalities, and the kind of canonical free markets we have do not account for these externalities. Now, before we come into how to think about these externalities, you want to think about, is the acknowledgement of this going to fundamentally change how we should think about markets? And I want to argue the answer is no, because even a free market is a regulated market, right? So a free market functions, and this would be something you would do probably in lecture 2 or 3, because there are rules of the game that are being set by someone. Someone is saying, how are we going to kind of deal with this situation that who has goods is not the person who wants to consume them? Well, there has to be a market. It has to be regulated. Someone's going to decide which contracts are going to work. How can you go to court if your contract is not completed? And in fact, these laws decide who gains from transactions very often. How you decide a legal contract will decide who benefits in the end if there's a dispute. What is the underlying, say, indemnity clauses that have been put in it? And so I think the way we should think about a world where we want to account for externalities is not a huge change in saying that we suddenly want the state to enter an arena that it wasn't in. The state was always there. What we're saying is that we want to think about a different set of rules of the game. We want to think about regulations and taxes that are now going to change the price of a good. And this, by doing so, it's actually going to change the identity of who wins and loses. And it's that last part that's going to be important in thinking about how exactly is this going to be able to be something that you pass. And this comes back to this idea that we need to start thinking about how we're going to have political consensus on such regulation. Let me give you 2 examples for why this is hard. So this is actually a stone quarry in Kenya that has been in the news very recently. So it's actually not a coal quarry, but it could very easily carry over. That this is a quarry where you were getting out stone, and the water that was going through there was carrying a lot of detritus down and leading to health issues downstream. Very recently, just a couple of weeks ago, the Kenyan government has banned this quarrying, and they've sort of blocked the quarries around. And it's led to a huge outcry, both by the mine owners, but also by the local population who's losing jobs. And so you can think of many natural resources like this. This is one example from Kenya. We can think of a similar example if you think about kind of coal mining areas in the United States, that even though these are dirty activities that hit the poor and move through the system, the poor in the moment also care about their employment. And so you have private benefits from a good like this, which are coming both from local employment and often for the rich, for these quarry miners who are not putting in place the regulated requirements to make sure the water is clean coming out of their quarries. They benefit by, in some sense, doing the cheapest, most polluting form of that activity. Importantly, very often, and we'll come back to this in an example I talk about from India, the negative costs are borne by people in a different political jurisdiction. In a lot of these activities of mining, it's water that carries it far away. In air pollution, you could have air pollution in China that affects people in Korea. You could have air pollution that goes across jurisdictions, both within and across countries. And that becomes very hard to regulate because the person who suffers from it is not actually the person, or is not the person whose government controls the policies. And what this means that there are 2 tensions. There's both the tension of the spatial difference, but there's also the case that the rich and poor often both oppose environmental regulations, but for different reasons. And another example of this we can see is if we look at protests over the removal of fossil fuels. So fossil fuel subsidies are one of the more intractable problems that we are seeing across the world. So in 2018, we know in France there were the Yellow Vest protests, which were very widespread. These were not limited to any single part of society. They went up from poor people to the middle class, arguing against the rise of prices on fossil fuels. In Kenya, there were large protests on fuel taxes in 2023, which caused the government to actually roll back its plans to remove fossil fuel subsidies. So here's, I think, a classic example where you often see this alignment across classes when it comes to pricing. To remind you that today, globally, the government spends more than $500 billion on fossil fuel subsidies. And pretty much across the world, we've seen it be very hard to remove these. And so we see this removal of pollution taxes being, or imposition of pollution taxes being hard because it's not that, of course, fossil fuel subsidies are transferring quite a lot of resources to companies that are producing the fossil fuels. But it is also seen by the poor as something, or the middle class as something that's benefiting them. And this, again, creates an alliance that's quite hard to break through. So here's a set of things I've talked about that's hard. So what can we do that can make a dent or can make progress? So I'm going to slightly cheat for a bit, but I think it's a useful cheat, which is I'm actually going to step back a bit from talking about how to think about political consensus, but turn to some of my work in India on air pollution regulation, which I think helps us answer an equally important question, which is both how do you get political consensus, but then how should you think about implementation? So the examples I talked about till now were ones where we didn't even get to the stage of implementation. But actually, we have had some progress in terms of at least protocols on carbon. And so I think it's important to remember that there are going to be two parts to the problem. One is going to be, which I'll come back to in the end, is what I laid out right now, is the issue of political consensus. The second is, even if you get to something like, say, the Paris Agreement right now, and you have countries that are making voluntary commitments to how much they're going to reduce carbon, what will it take for it to be achieved? And what will it take for it to be achieved in countries like India and China, which are projected to be some of the largest emitters going forward, but still right now have kind of low government capacity? And so I want to talk about that, and I want to kind of motivate it by showing you this graph on pollution. So what this shows you is this shows you across the world the pollution levels across cities that have monitoring systems in place. So it's a selected sample. And I want you to take away two facts from this. So if we start from the bottom up, the US has largely resolved, or the North America, I would say, has largely resolved its air pollution problem. So you can see that the dotted line is the WHO regulatory threshold, which at the time the data was 10. It's actually now been pushed down to 5. And most of the cities are green. They are below that. Europe has more work to do. China has some more work to do, and India has a lot of work to do. The other thing that I think is actually striking to see is that as countries have more cities out of compliance, they actually also make the regulatory standards more lax. So the dark line is actually the regulatory standard the place. So in the US, at the time of this, which was 5 years ago, it was around 11. In Europe, already averaging across the set of countries, it's 20. China is 30, and India is 40. Human beings are the same. Their lungs don't change depending on whether they live in the US or they live in India. But governments are trying to have goals that they hope they can reach. We will see some of the same in carbon, right? The first best solution for carbon is a tax on carbon, which is the same across all countries, because a unit of greenhouse gas goes into the air and merges everywhere, and it doesn't matter who emits it. But we have to realize that the first fact we're going to see is that certainly countries are going to say our ability or our just the kind of just choice we have to make is going to differ based on many things, including where we are in economic development and where they see their standard is. And this is something we see for air pollution as well, even though this is much more of a local issue. The second is a quote that I think is, this was the then Prime Minister of India, and he was talking about the role of standards. He said, I must emphasize standards are not enough. They must be enforced, which is what we're going to talk about today. But it's also important that these standards do not bring back the license permit Raj, which we sought to get rid of in the wake of economic reforms in India in the 90s. And when you talk to governments in countries like India, that's their big concern with what they feel is being asked for them in these summits, is that you're going to ask us to put in place regulation, and that regulation is going to bring down economic growth and possibly be a source of corruption. So the license permit Raj, which was constraints on how much import and export you could have within countries, so what was the tariff on imports into India, was seen as something that was also a source of, these license permits were a source for bureaucrats to make money. And also, just to remind you, this is from a recent 2020 data set, and what this shows you, it's a graph of countries. And again, it shows you on the x-axis is GDP or country income. On the y-axis is their tax revenue as a share of GDP. And you can see that just your ability to collect taxes is increasing in income. So if you think of a country in Africa or in South Asia, these are going to be countries that are much poorer, but they also have much less ability to collect taxes. And this is both in the moment going to limit their ability to enforce regulatory standards or regulations, but it also is one of the reasons that creates an argument often for climate finance, that if you care about it, you have to start from the fact that a lot of these countries are not going to have the resources. So it's not just a question of will, it's also a question of capacity. So I want to sort of now ask the question against this background, and I think this is an important precursor to thinking about what we can be doing while we're trying to solve the problem of political consensus. I think we'll come to that later. I think it's a hard problem, but if we can get some of the building blocks in place for how to have regulatory enforcement that works, that will only be a good and important thing once we get some kind of consensus, some kind of agreement on what countries should be doing to move towards renewable energy and reduce carbon emissions. Because we can get the political, if we ever got political consensus and we got an international body that agreed on these issues, that's not very valuable if countries then say, we're doing it, but nothing is happening. And as I'll talk about later, that has very much, for example, been the experience of the carbon offset market. We've seen a lot of money going to it, but the carbon offset market is, right now we're seeing it crash across the world because all the data that's coming out is saying is that, it's not being verified, and what is being verified suggests that there's no difference being made by the programs. So getting these building blocks in place, I would argue, is something we should be doing and is politically feasible right now, while we're trying to still work on the trickier problem of having an overall framework that would work. So I'm going to talk about India, and in India, as in many countries, the main way pollution standards are held, they're set at a national level. They're command and control regulation, which means that any single, say, industrial unit has to meet a certain standard at its own plant level. So it's an inflexible standard that will say typically, this is how much pollution you can put out in the air, or this is how much pollution you can put out in the water. These states are going to implement this, and they can tighten the standard. They can say, we want to go for a tighter standard, but they cannot relax it. And this enforcement is done by state pollution control boards. They are created with the responsibility, but typically they don't have a lot of resources. And I should say the template of what India follows was very much based on the EPA regulations in the US, which have been the template for many countries across the world. So I want to start by talking about private third parties. And as I'm going to talk about, especially if you think about voluntary reductions, which we'll come to when we come to climate breakdown policies, these are important players. So they are important players because they are private, so they can, if they're paid, you can find people willing to enter the market. You don't have to go through public sector recruitment. And they're currently playing an important role in certification. So this is both for environmental standards like ISO standards, but also for carbon offsets. So if you are buying a flight ticket and they say, pay $20 and we'll take care of the emissions of this flight, what is that airline company doing? It's basically providing money to some company that has been authorized, certified by these third-party auditors as having shown that preventing deforestation through a policy done by some company they certify is actually reducing carbon emissions. But the main problem, I think this has been identified in many places, including during the financial crisis, is that there are mixed incentives by this company. The auditors have to get business. They typically are being paid by the firm that they're auditing, and that gives them a lot of incentives to, on the margin, say someone is doing a fine job when they're not, because they want to, and this problem is particularly true in lower income countries where reputational concerns are often not that important. So what did we do? So we actually worked in the state of Gujarat with the regulator, and the start was interesting. It was actually because the firms had decided that they were being asked to pay for this regulation, for these audits, but the regulator wasn't using the data. And so they went to the court to say, we want you to stop this program because we are being asked to pay for a program the regulator isn't using. And the regulator said, well, we are not using this data because we think it's completely corrupted. So the court came back to them and told the regulator, you have a certain amount of time, you have to come up with a better policy that will work, otherwise we'll remove the policy. This was, and as much of research as it was happenstance, the environmental lawyer representing the Pollution Control Board happened to be where I was then teaching in Harvard Kennedy School for an executive education program, heard from someone that there are now economists working on evidence-based policy, and literally just walked into my office and said, we have this problem, could you help us? Second happenstance, I happened to be going to India within the month, and I said, I'll come to your state and talk to you. And that's what started this collaboration. And as you'll see, it's been very fruitful over the last decade. So how did this work in the status quo? So the status quo is very similar to what you can think happens, for instance, in financial accounting of many companies right now. The plant is responsible for hiring and paying the auditor. The auditor takes these pollution readings and submits it to the regulator. And as the regulator said, there was a lot of perception that there was widespread auditor shopping, so you would go and kind of find an environmental lab and then negotiate on price, and often the price would be so low that those lab tests couldn't be done for the price, but the auditor will say, fine, I'll do it, and then they'll just tick the box. So what we did is, and this is going to be a common theme of the three studies I'm going to talk about, is we ran what we call a field experiment. So it's very similar to, say, medical trials, with the difference that these are typically not double-blind. But we worked at scale, and this was the important part of working with the government and regulator, and half the plants were under the status quo system that I just explained, and the other half were told that you're being enrolled in a pilot scheme where you will not choose your auditor. It'll be assigned to you by the regulator, and there'll be a fixed payment from a central pool of funds that you have to pay into, and then these auditors will actually be back-checked on performance. We also had performance incentives the second year, but I'm really going to talk about what we found to be important was the fact that you cut the firm's ability to either choose the auditor, but more importantly, to negotiate on price with them. So if you look at the first graph, this is, look at the top panel. This just plots the data from the audit reports in the group under the status quo, and the status quo is called control very often. So what you see, the red line is the regulatory standard. That was what was supposed to be regulatory standard. And you see a huge mass right to the left of it. So basically the average audit report, more than the average audit report, was saying that this is a plant that is in compliance, and typically pretty much just in compliance between 100 and 150. The bottom panel is the independent back checks that the regulator hired environmental labs independently, and they typically tried to go in the same month as they knew the auditors were going to go, but just went and did independent reports, and what you can see there is a complete distribution, right? So basically there is very little bunching, and it's across the board. The other thing that's going to be important is that it's not just, if you will, violators, right? So everyone above 150 is a violator. They're benefiting from it, but there are actually a lot of people below it. And they also were not actually getting the truth about their readings. They were just all being bunched up at the same place. And I highlight this because this heterogeneity tells you that there is possibility for gains from trade here, right? So this paper looks at just reducing the conflict of interest, but this also tells us why market instruments may do a better job in providing flexibility, because a plant that's emitting very little may be willing to trade if we give them permits of up to 150 with a plant that's above it. And that flexibility is going to be something that is more valuable than having absolute standards at the level per plant. So this is looking at conflict of interest of auditors. This is what we see in the control. And then in the treatment group, where if you remember, we cut the conflict of interest, now you see there's still some bunching. So the audits at the top is still some bunching. But the mass in this top end is just 39% of the data versus the previous slide where it was 72%. So there's a lot less bunching. And it's much more comparable on both sides. So especially for the clean firms, we see a lot more distribution of data. So this is what you see, that basically when we ask where did we lose people from once we introduce the treatment relative to the control is really that piece around the regulatory standards. So just saying all those people who just ticked the box of 145 or 140 were much more likely to be placed somewhere else by the auditors. Importantly, what we found, and I think this is the part that mattered, is we found that actually when we did an inline survey of pollution levels fell by a significant amount. And this reflects the fact that there were two parts to the issue. The first was the conflict of interest, but the second was the regulator needed to have credibility that they would actually impose punishments once they get true data. And we were, in that sense, I guess, happy that we were working with the regulator with that credibility. So when we looked at where we saw reductions in pollutions coming from, it was the most extreme violators. And these most extreme violators, if the regulator acts on them, tends to act on them not by sending letters, but actually just shutting down the plant. Because in the end, kind of the pollution at very high levels is seen as a health hazard, and so you can shut down plants. And so that tells us that, again, you should take this piecemeal approach, but it remains important in this case that the regulator has credibility. And this is going to be something that resonates for us even in the second study that I'll come to, but just to summarize here, we found that when we reduced the auditor's conflict of interest, pollution was reduced in a setting where we see that the regulator had a track record of penalizing large violators, and the second part was important. So now I want to come to kind of what we've built on yet. So I should say, life is long, and we've been working with this regulator for a long time, which is on a day-to-day basis very frustrating, but also very rewarding in the longer run. So we've been working for them for over a decade. After we completed their study, they were like, so what do we do next? Where do we go next? And one of the things that came up was, well, you're seeing all this heterogeneity. As economists, what we would say, this is exactly a place where allowing for trade should have gains. And so recall that the basic status quo is a command and control inflexible emission cap that exists per plant where you have to have these high costs. And so I might be a plant that has a sudden gain in, say, demand. So this is very true in many of these populations. So for instance, the textile firms. So in fact, right now it's mid-September. In this area, one of the big periods when they have to increase production is what is called known as the pre-Diwali period. So the pre-Diwali period is a high demand period, especially for clothing. Many of these plants are going to have very productive opportunities, but be above their cap, and so therefore be penalized by the regulator on a status quo system. But if they could trade, for instance, with another sector which doesn't have a seasonal demand spike in the same period, you could keep the total amount constant or reduce it. And again, as I said, if you're within a common area, what we would call the air shelter is the same. It doesn't matter for someone breathing in the air, whether it comes from industry A or industry B, which are both 500 meters from their house. And that's really the idea of trying to think about whether this is a place where you can have markets or you can have cap and trade. So the way a cap and trade system would work is that you have a governing body, the state, the regulator. You're going to establish a total cap. So this could be, and we'll come to that later, talking about greenhouse gases. In this case, it's about pollution. So it's going to say this is the total amount of particulate matter that we should see in the air. Then you give all the firms who are in that air shed permits of how much each of them can emit. And the act of giving permits is where you can take care of distributional issues. So you can say if a plant is, kind of small or poor, you can give them a lot more permits for free at the start, or in some cases you can actually sell them. So the regulator has a lot of control to take account of distributional concerns at this point. But once it's done, companies trade. And they trade, in the case of India, on actually a commodities platform which is nationally recognized. And a low emissions firm can then sell these permits. And the hope is that the markets will set the price and we'll find the cheapest way to reduce emissions. Now, the concern, of course, when we first started talking about this, and this was literally a system, we wrote the first white paper for the government in 2010 and launched it in 2019, was that, how are we going to get credible emissions data? So you have to do a bunch of work putting in place continuous emissions monitoring systems. Do we actually have a trading platform? Will firms understand it? And then I think credibility of the regulator again. Suppose I don't have enough permits at the end of a trading period. Will the regulator actually dare to penalize a firm, or will the firm call up kind of their political bosses and get out of it? And then the market will obviously crash. So we ran this for a year, and it was incredibly successful. I think the first part that was successful was, unsurprisingly, firms understand how to trade. They are very comfortable trading on these platforms. They trade, they keep at the end of the bid period the permits they need. At the end of the first period of trade, there were 2 plants that were out of compliance, and the regulator took a very harsh stand. So everyone had to post a bond, and the regulator deducted a lot of resources from it. And I think that meant that everyone saw that and stayed with it. So this was the airshed. So as I said, it's important to do this in a certain airshed of an area. So you can see the black dots were the control, the blue were the treatment, very next to each other. So they're affecting the same area in Surat, in Gujarat. And these were the questions we were interested in. Will plants trade? Would they comply? And what would it cost to abate? Is it going to be cheap relative to other things they could do? And this is really the one graph I'm going to show you from this. We have very nice graphs showing how well the permit bidding worked, but all I want to show you here is that the blue line is the treatment firms, their emissions. The dark line, the black line is control. The first vertical line you see is we had 2 periods of mock trading to make sure that people understand how trading works. And what you see is that there's an initial drop everywhere, which is sort of compositional because more plants are coming on board. But basically, the moment we started period 1, we see this gap emerge between the emissions rate in the control, which was under the status quo, and in the market. And overall, we reduced emissions by around 20%, which is a huge gain for this area, just in terms of plant emissions. And we also found that the cost difference was very low. And the reason the cost difference was very low is that actually under a command system, what you can do is you can force people to put in place air filters and scrubbers. What you can't force them to do is to put on the electricity. And so what this did is it made them clean their filters, it made them put on the electricity, but that's actually a relatively low cost. It's just that people don't do it when they don't feel that they needed to. But they had mostly installed the equipment, so it was not very expensive. So compliance was almost perfect. We saw active trading throughout the month. They could trade there was an auction every Tuesday, and then you could do over-the-counter trades for the rest of the week. Abatement costs were low. They were roughly actually 12% higher in the command and control than in the emissions market. And so what we find that the firms value this regulation, they participated in this market. Since then, we ran the experiment for a year. After that, the regulator actually brought in the control plants into emissions. So in Surat now, all the black dots are also part of the market. And on September 1, just a couple of weeks ago, we actually launched another market in another cluster in Gujarat, in Ahmedabad. And the aim over the next 5 years is to kind of launch more markets, because markets to start with should be in the clusters that matter. And then we want to try to see if we can now start having trade across markets. The last example I want to talk to, and then I'll come to just some brief learnings for climate change, and I think it's one that Kate talked about, is on crop burning. So North India has incredibly high pollution rates in the winter. I think if you ever go there in December, January, I think you really physically feel it. You feel it physically most of the time, but especially at that time of the year. And the health costs are seen to be very high. One of the things that economic development did in North India is it brought mechanized harvesting. Mechanized harvesting was very valuable along with the Green Revolution in that it led farmers to start double cropping, and that's sort of seen as one of the big kind of 1960s innovations in agriculture that has made a lot of these countries sustainable when it comes to food. But the cost that it had is it left a very short period when you had to clear your crop of the residue that you get from mechanized harvesting between the 2 seasons, between when you have your rice season and then you have to remove the residue and you have to sow your wheat. And the cheapest thing for farmers was to do is to just burn the crop. And the problem is, it's a classic problem that the costs are borne downstream. So this is what would happen even this year. We expect this to happen starting in another month or so. Farmers are going to burn their fields to get rid of crop residue. And this is what it's going to look like in Delhi. There are like 3 or 4 days where literally Delhi is covered with smog. And at its peak, it's supposed to be around 30% of the pollution. Now, farmers do it because it's cheap. If you get these other ways of managing it, it costs a reasonable amount of money. But from a regulator's perspective, you totally want to figure out how to get them the money to do it. It's the mortality costs are 200 to 600 times higher. And I talk about this because, I think this is, you could think of a similar case of this being true in thinking about, for instance, how to prevent Amazonian burning or deforestation in many parts of the world, which is one of the big issues people are thinking about in climate breakdowns, is how do you actually prevent that? Across the world, and including in India, we've seen the Indian government has made burning illegal, hasn't had much effect. It has provided for the last few years subsidies, but the subsidies don't seem to be large enough. They're not enough to make people take up these alternative ways. And really, at the heart of it is this political economy issue that these local governments are just not electorally accountable to those with the cost. And I think that's a very similar issue if you think about what was happening in Brazil. And under the previous government, the Brazilian government felt that the benefits they would have by developing the Amazon very fast locally would be much higher than any benefits they would have from preventing climate breakdowns. So one set of possibilities that a lot of people have thought about in the case of deforestation or such policy, and I'm going to come back to it in climate breakdowns briefly, is what are known as RED, or payment for ecosystems, where you take farmers or you take communities and you say, we'll give you money if you don't undertake an activity. And so the don't undertaking the activity can be you don't deforest. In this particular case, the activity would be don't burn your crop. But what we were interested in thinking about is how do we design this? So when we did a bunch of focus groups, we heard 2 issues of why, if we just told people that you need to not burn your crop and then you'll get money, was that we don't trust you. You're saying this now, but you'll just disappear from the village and no one will come back and give us money, and we don't trust the government for subsidies. And the second was liquidity. We don't have the money to do this. So this made us ask the question, can you do better if you have an upfront payment for ecosystems where you actually give money upfront that is then used to repay? The problem, of course, is if you give upfront payments, you improve trust, you reduce liquidity, but you also reduce a farmer incentives to comply, because I now have less money to get afterwards. For instance, I give you all the money upfront, why should I not burn? I've got the money in hand and no one's going to come and ask me for the money back. So this was a reason to test this, to ask what would happen. And so we tested 2 arms, whether you actually got resources upfront, partial, or you didn't get any and you would be paid afterwards. The second issue you face is how do you monitor? So, and I think this is a classic problem scale, and this is where I think, social scientists can really benefit from working with people who are making huge advances in the sciences and machine learning and other areas. So this is this is satellite imagery from one of the many satellite imageries across the world. Now it's very good, actually. You can get it down to a resolution that is a Punjabi farmer's farm. And what this shows you, the first one is you can see the plot. That's the plot that we had someone walk out, and you can see it's green in the first one, so no burning is taking place. The second one is you burnt, and then 1 week after burning, they've started putting in other crops, and the soil actually recovers very fast. So the one issue you can see with this monitoring is the monitoring actually has to be done very close to when the burning happens, because satellite imagery changes quite fast afterwards. So you need satellite imagery quite soon, but luckily I think you now get it in the system. The next part, of course, is doing it from the outside requires you to go and plot every piece of land, which is harder. We did it for this pilot. You could imagine doing this at the village level where those requirements would be less. So this is the main alternative to burning. So what you can do is when we gave them the money, we didn't know what they would do, but what we found afterwards was this is the main thing they did. So basically, there were a bunch of biogas and other plants that have come up around there. They would send their trucks and a baler. This is the baler making the bales, and then they will send it to the biogas plant. Now, of course, you could say that just delays when it's burnt and put in the air, and so I think there's some work to be done at that end, but that seemed to be the choice. So what this shows you is the set of results. It's a complex graph, but if you look at the first set of bars on the left, it compares across the blue and the orange, where you were just told If you don't burn, we'll give you money afterwards. And what we varied is how much money we gave you per acre, either 800 or 1600. And you can see basically take-up was quite similar across the groups. But then when we look at compliance with the contract in terms of the fact that afterwards they called us and said, we've done the right thing, and then we sent people to check that whether they had, you can basically see that with upfront payment, it's roughly twice the size of no upfront payment. So if you take the green bar, 7% complied in that they took up the contract and then actually didn't burn, while those who had the same amount of money, 800 rupees per acre, and got 25% upfront, were twice as likely to comply. And you see the same kind of effect when we look at it on satellite imagery, which is the last two bars. And so what we find is that this upfront payment, I should say the cost effectiveness is not obvious. Because take-up wasn't so huge, we doubled the rates of people who didn't burn, but we still gave a lot of money to people upfront who did burn. While in the standard PES, you're not giving that money till later. So in thinking of cost effectiveness, you actually have to ask this question is, did you gain more from the people who didn't burn versus the others who you gave the money to and they continued to burn? What we find is it obviously increases the cost. So if you use mortality estimates, it costs you roughly $4,000 per life saved. But recall, this is against a place where when you shut down a coal-fired power plant, sorry, not shut down, when you put a scrub in a coal-fired power plant, it's something that governments, very often regulators do. Well, that's $400,000 per life saved. So the mortality effects are large enough that it's worth it. But the key question remains who will pay. And what we have found since then, I think our results are very robust, but the political economy situation is hard to deal with here because Punjab and the central government are different political parties in charge. And the central government keeps saying we want the state government to pay, and then the state government is, but all the health costs are downstream, they need to contribute to it, and so there's a bit of an impasse there. And so now let me take the last 10 minutes to relate this to climate breakdown policies. But let me just summarize, I think, two main takeaways that I hope are useful. That, as I said, political consensus, I don't think I have great answers on how to achieve it, but I do think we can start going a long way in a lot of developing countries, certainly ones which are going to be large emitters like India, in terms of trying to identify how to get regulations that get incentives correctly in place. And so I think, of course, politics is going to matter, but so is the economics of implementation. Who benefits, who loses, and how do we verify? And I think that technological challenges verification is a very robust area for economists and data scientists and others to collaborate. So let me now try to kind of zoom out a bit, and I should apologize up front. You're certainly going to find there's a bit of a slip between the cup and the lip between the kind of tight experimental studies I talked about and how I'm going to extrapolate them to climate change, but maybe that's what we need right now. So let me just start by reminding you, we have current policies, they're not working, right? This is one of the most famous graphs that we all see from the Scripps CO2 program that just reminds us about the continuing, almost linear rise that we are seeing in carbon dioxide concentration across the world. What are the policy instruments that are on the table and that are being discussed? So if you talk to economists, they will always tell you the first best policy is a carbon tax. But it's a very particular kind of carbon tax. It's a carbon tax that equals the social cost of carbon. So you have to figure out what is the cost, the externality cost in terms of emissions of an activity. And then importantly, this carbon tax must equal the social cost of carbon across countries. So this is not something that's going to be higher in Canada and the US than in Gambia. It should actually be exactly the same to be the first best because greenhouse gas emissions in the air hit everyone equally. That, of course, in a lot of ways makes it very hard to achieve, and so that's one thing. And partly for that reason, how far have legal arrangements got? So both in the Kyoto Protocol and most recently in the Paris Agreement, the focus was on voluntary country commitments. So you don't have penalties for violations, so it's voluntary. And you basically have countries put forward how they want to reach a certain specified % reduction in carbon emissions from a base year they choose themselves. It's very weak, but if there's a will, this is the kind of place where implementation lessons really matter, because how is India going to reach its stated goals without dealing with the implementation concerns, even though we know their incentives overall to do it are probably quite weak as well. And the third one that I already talked about is to think of having markets. So you basically have markets in which carbon emissions are going to be traded, and perhaps the best known example right now of this is the European Union emission trading scheme, which extends across a set of European countries. In the US, you have REGI, which is the one doing it regionally, so you have some set of states under it. But these are the three main policies that I think it's fair to say are on the table. And so let's think about this directly regulating quantities. So one of the ways we've seen the voluntary reductions try to work is really carbon offset programs. So there are a lot of carbon offset programs. And in 2021, the unregulated voluntary market had a total value of $2 billion. For the land use sector, most of this came from forest projects, which had a similar flavor, if you will, to what I was talking about earlier with payment for ecosystems, is that you have groups that will, say in Kenya or somewhere else, who you would say, we are paying them to not cut down trees, and that's what you're getting when you participate in this carbon offset program. There's recently been an important study in Science magazine that looked across a set of these carbon offset programs undertaken by Verra, which is the world's leading certifier. And they found that they were largely worthless and could make global heating worse if they were used. The CEO of Verra resigned, not necessarily because of the study, but around the same time it was sort of seen. But importantly, it's also clear that this was a company that had a huge conflict of interest. It was making 92% of its money by taking a cut from the sale of carbon credits. So, sort of spending the time and effort to actually find a carbon credit scheme that works in a world where you're not really being verified that much is harder to justify if you think you can get away without it. And I think right now, carbon credit, if you look at the market, if you look at the stocks of a lot of these companies, carbon offset markets, they're crashing in many places. Because I think there's growing recognition of this poor verification. I think that's where we can take lessons from how you can actually set up incentive schemes, how you can better use satellite imagery and other data to do better. The second thing is climate financing. So climate financing is talked about a lot. It's clearly going to be a critical component of what we need. But right now, I think if you talk to anyone from a lower income country, there was a recent Africa Climate Summit which ended where this was a big issue being discussed. They are largely designed still as loans. They're largely designed as loans that a low income country has very little incentive to take up. These are estimates that tell you how much of these are grants and how much of these are loans and equity, how much of it is private finance. And you can see that grants are not increasing very much. And so if you want to stick with climate financing, I think there needs to be some inherent rethinking of how to structure it. Either we need to go the way of, how do we give loans to poor individuals, but again, why would people have incentives to take up something like this? So I think at the heart of it, we need to really rethink the financing of climate financing. And we're continuing to fail to price a social cost of carbon. Australia was a famous recent example where the previous prime minister made a pledge in blood that he will get rid of the carbon tax, and they successfully managed to axe an existing carbon tax. So this is the carbon tax repeal bill that passed, and Australia is now unlikely to meet its 5% emissions target. So it's again a good reminder that just passing it once is not enough. You're going to have to prevent it from unraveling as well. And finally, I think I talked about this, fossil fuel subsidies not only remain attractive, but when you have points of crisis like we did with, electricity becoming or gas becoming expensive with the Ukraine-Russia war last year, countries do, for political reasons, step in and increase subsidies. And that just shows you that last year was one of the highest subsidy levels. The dark red is the explicit subsidy, the light orange is the implicit based on health costs, but even the direct subsidy increased. And so again, just to remind you, regulating global house gases is hard. I've talked about most of this. It's going to be borne by those outside the country boundaries. And it's disequalizing who bears the burden, and this is going to make political consensus hard. I think trying to get global consensus on prices on something like taxes is going to also be very hard. If we just look at SO2 regulation and shipping fuel, which has passed now, and so we have maritime regulation on SO2 in fuel, it took 15 years to pass, and that was a very small sector. You know, the tax of carbon without redistribution is like a consumption tax. EU, for instance, has now said that the way it wants to try to think about the fact that all countries are not imposing the same tax is by having a carbon adjustment border tax. But again, most studies show who is this going to hit? Well, people who are sending dirty imports into EU, which tend to still be the poorest countries. So the carbon adjustment tax, maybe it will make Gambia invest in cleaner ways of getting aluminum, but it's certainly in the short run just going to reduce its ability to sell in EU without necessarily giving it the financing to engage in more expensive regions. So I guess I just want to sort of leave with the suggestion that I think we should be thinking much more seriously about carbon markets. I think you can use the initial distribution of emissions to much more directly address redistributional issues. There is flexibility, and I think what we've seen is market players, firms in particular, know how to trade, they know how to do permits, and it does encourage people to invest in these sort of longer-term investments in technologies, which are now increasingly becoming available, and you have to incentivize firms how to take it up. And again, I think, trade in goods and services got negotiated, and so this may well be something that negotiated. This is just a reminder of what the markets look like today. So the dark blue is you have emissions trading scheme and a carbon tax, both of them. Light blue is just ETS. Green is where you have a carbon tax emitted, and then other thing. And so, it's beginning to spread, I think, the carbon markets. But I think, of course, as economists, I would never say carbon taxes are not the first best, but I'm increasingly pessimistic about it. Having said that, let me, in my last slide, say what more will be needed. And this is, I'm going to pick on Kate's, ending with a historic reference and end also with a historic reference. I don't know how many of you have heard of the Great Stink. So the Great Stink is this great example of the Thames River that was incredibly dirty, and basically a lot of sewage went directly in it without treating. This was going on for years. It was leading to things like cholera. I think there was some recognition, but there was no correction happening. Two things happened. The king and queen of England decided to go on a boat trip around the Thames and had to turn back because this miasma smell was so strong. The second, if any of you have been to London, the Parliament is on the Thames. The Parliament had to shut its sessions because people could not bear to be in the Parliament because it was so stinky. It was when it hit those people at that level is when very fast regulation got passed. And so I think in the end, I don't have solutions for political consensus, but in some ways you feel like what you're going to need is for those who really matter in political consensus to start directly feeling the cost or somehow being made to feel the cost in order for us to see that political consensus. I think I've slightly run over time, so I should stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your talk. You mentioned right
If you could introduce yourself, that'd be great for me, so I have a sense.
Oh, sure. My name is Hannah. I studied oceanography. I am not a student here. But, there we go.
Yeah.
My question is, if a student comes to you and says, I recognize the importance of working directly on climate policy implementation, what kinds of institutions or job roles would you advise them to look for? If that's the career path that you want to set out, where would you advise that student to look in order to be effective in doing that work?
That's a hard question, and I'm going to, I hope, give some answer, but also slightly punt, which I think there are many different jobs you can do. So I think one question that I would be best addressed, I would ask the student, is which part of it do you want to contribute to? Because, as I said, you should not think of research or science right now being now so devoid from the world. I hope one thing I've tried to bring across is that you can actually be studying and researching these questions and directly working and implementing it. So I think one thing I would say is that, think about what you have an appetite for. If you have an appetite for making sure you understand the knowledge and then transmitting it to individuals, then think of doing at least a master's, something to be confident with that body of knowledge, creating those connections, and then take it out in the world. And that's the one that I'm best equipped to advise you how to do. You may not want to do that. I think you may think, I want to be a lawyer and I want to kind of directly negotiate, or I want to be in the ground and be an activist. Then I'd say I have no expertise on how to get into it, but what I would still tell you is some social science knowledge, some knowledge of understanding how it's not going to be enough to just get a technology or a law, but really thinking about human behavior and incentives is going to be key. So please take at least one economics class.
Thank you.
How are people on lower income levels expected to respect carbon taxes when their rich counterparts can just afford, or they don't mind, to pay more for like gas prices, for example?
Sorry, I'm happy to answer, but could you just tell me who you are as well? I'm just curious to know.
Like personal background?
No, just if you're studying here, if you're
Yeah, I'm studying here. I'm in legal studies program.
Okay. So I think that's a very good question. If I had more time, I would have actually talked about that, so I'm glad you asked that. I think it's incredibly important to figure out how you make these kind of, say, removals of subsidies progressive. And I think, so I'll give an example of what one of my colleagues is doing in India, who's trying to think about how do we remove subsidies on electricity. And he's trying to ask, how do you combine removal of subsidies with direct benefit transfers? One of the things that actually is certainly good in some countries now is that we can target and we can make transfers to poor households, right? So you could either do that, for instance, on a voluntary basis. So you could say if you're below a certain threshold, you can either be, exempt from tax on certain consumptions, or you're going to get a certain lump sum amount, which is based on the average consumption of people in your income bracket. The other thing you can do is you can actually make the carbon tax also, which is going, to think about how to do it in ways that is progressive by having bans on it. So I think that's a critical part of what has failed right now with fossil fuel subsidy removals, is that when governments announce them, they just announce the pushback of it, rather than talking about what are they going to be accompanying to ensure that it remains progressive. And I think that's a key part, so thank you for raising that.
Hi, hello. Thanks so much for your talk. I was just wondering, so when you showed the slide with like the WHO, how they provide the pollution expectations for countries, and like how the U.S. was doing so much better than India. I was just wondering if there's any, it makes sense to give different thresholds to countries, because India deals so much with different climate and wealth inequality and stuff like that, like density and everything.
It depends on what you think that regulatory limit is reflecting. As I said, the lungs are the same no matter which body you're in. So if you think that regulatory standard is supposed to capture a level below which your lungs are not affected, then this standard should be the same. But I think what you're exactly right is that when the government is setting the standard, it's sort of trying to be a bit pragmatic and saying, well, that exists, but we also have to do these other things. So I think it's really a question of how you define where you get to the regulatory standard. What I think is incorrect, and certainly I've seen politicians in India make the case to say that the Indian body can tolerate higher levels of pollution.
Okay, thanks so much. Thank you.
Hi. So my background, I have a master's degree from the University of Toronto in small-scale farming, and I always wanted to look at the nexus between livelihoods, so beautiful livelihoods, and then what can be actually supported by our system. And so I was wondering, if you were to put together a team of people, interdisciplinary team of people, to solve the problems that you see on the ground, who would you put on your team, and how would you go about thinking about this interdisciplinary team?
I mean, I think interdisciplinary teams are incredibly important to have. I mean, I think I gave you the example of crop burning. We worked with people on the remote sensing side to figure out how to come up with our verification technology. I think we could have done more in terms of understanding, alternative ways of dealing with how to get rid of crop residue. For instance, now people claim that they have fertilizers that also dissolve crop residue. I think the hard thing is, how do you get people to talk in some ways similar enough language to make progress? And I think also these are often management issues. So I increasingly feel that a lot of this research policy, one of the things we should be doing is actually, I don't know, working maybe with people in the private sector otherwise who actually thought hard about management issues. I think academics are very bad at thinking about human relations and those issues. And I find now, 50 or 60% of my time is not sitting and doing research. It's actually trying to think about exactly these questions. How do you put together teams? How do you actually deal with lots of these issues? But we never trained in it, so
Right.
we're not very good at it.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
So we have time for more questions, if anyone, yeah? Okay, great, thank you. And please also join us afterward. We have time as well. There's food, and there's a nice reception out after.
Hi, so I'm a student here in my first year. I wanted to ask, how effective do you think genetic engineering is for farming? So I know they use genome editing and GMO seeds. So how effective do you think that is for this?
Effective for what?
Just general the environment and climate change as compared to the other farming methods.
So I don't know about genetic farming, so I can't speak to that. I would say the one place where we have work that has shown to be very promising is what people will call drought-resistant seeds. So I think another thing, I was talking a lot today, if you will, about, in some ways, mitigation, right? How do you reduce emissions? The problem, or the question for a lot of lower-income countries, especially, say, in sub-Saharan Africa or countries like Nepal and others, is their energy use is very low. But what they're facing today already is the effects in terms of, say, extreme weather incidents. And so they need to be thinking about adaptation. And one of the key places they need to be thinking about adaptation is in agriculture. And so, the question is, for instance, is drought-resistant seeds valuable? Is drip water farming that uses much less water, can you make it as effective as sort of flooding your entire field when you're sowing paddy? There's been a lot of work on that. I haven't heard, but that's probably my ignorance on how genetic modified seeds actually help deal with extreme weather patterns.
Hi, my name is Sharzad. I'm a student here. I'm studying economics. So we've talked a lot about the income inequality and the role that that plays in this issue, but given that there's a lot of students in this room, I wonder what relation does the income inequality have also with different age groups and the demographics that different age groups play in this issue, and how are we holding different age groups responsible or kind of addressing them differently? Because I know a lot of the time older generations might kind of brush this issue off as the next generation's problem. So what aspect does that play in this issue?
I think certainly when we look at any surveys on kind of both belief in climate breakdowns and what should be done, we see this huge age gradient, as you said. Younger cohorts are just much more aware, but much more also willing to undertake preventive actions or change their behaviors. And again, I think in some ways this is a kind of a political issue, right? How do you get younger generations to engage with the political system? I think there's also a lot of almost kind of lack of belief that regular politics can achieve change. And I guess this is maybe a place where I am old school, and I think we need to get regular politics to work. And I would say that's a place where I think you want the younger generation to engage and possibly displace some of the very old individuals who are perhaps, or even not even just very old, but people who are very beholden over the years to, where they get money from in politics, right? That's another part of it, is how do fossil fuel companies and others maintain their say? There's a lot of lobbying that goes on, say, in the Beltway of DC around that. How does the younger generation respond to it? You can certainly have movements, as we do, of not just Greenpeace, but other ones like Extinction Rebellion and others that take really grassroots, on-the-street activism. And again, as I said, I'm old, so maybe I don't fully see this, but I feel maybe more success will be achieved through being organized in politics than being outside.
Hi, hello. I'm Abel, fourth year math econ here at Waterloo. And I just wanted to ask a question about, I guess, the relationship between like pollution and economic development, because we've seen like historically a lot of countries when they hit that great like economic boom, a lot of pollution is created with it. We had like Europe, like London and America. Now we have China and India. And I think moving forward, it's probably going to go to more of the global south. So how do you, I guess, disincentivize countries from going with that exact same pattern of behavior on like the political economic side?
I think we have, I think, of course, in the end, it's the way of providing the money, and I think that's giving the example of the farmers in Punjab. It is a financial decision. We have a lot more ways of dealing with pollution now. First of all, we have much better ways of monitoring pollution. We also have a lot better sense of the health costs of air pollution. You could say that in the 1940s or 1950s, yes, Europe was very polluted, but they also didn't realize the cost of it. It's like smoking. Right? People did not realize the cost of it. So it's not, I don't think it's an intrinsic fact. I think it was a combination, partly, of course, economic development without regulation is going to be polluting. But I think the ability to reduce it was not something that was taken up at scale, partly because people didn't realize the health costs of it, and we didn't have a lot of the technologies. We now have both of those at much better scale. So I think if we can just figure a way of covering costs, we can get there. And again, just to give you the example of India and crop burning, India is relatively, or the Indian middle upper class in India can certainly afford to make those payments to farmers if they say one-by-one transaction for the gains in health that they will see. We just right now don't have, through the political system, a coordinating mechanism to raise that tax revenue and then transfer it to the farmers. That's not going to be true in every country. I realize if you're thinking about, say, DRC, you may just say it's very poor, but typically when you're that poor, you're not polluting very much. So I think once countries are polluting that much, if they can use redistribution, I think they should be able to cover the costs.
Thank you.
Hello. I just did my econ undergrad here, and I'm from India as well, so I'm kind of interested in the politics of the crop burning issue. So I know you said like there's issues between the union government and Punjab about some of the funding for some of these schemes, but has there been any collaboration or talks or any scope for collaboration between maybe like Delhi, Haryana, and Punjab, like at the state level?
So I think the main way that this cooperation has happened, and in the US actually it was the same, is through the court system, right? So if you think about the US and you think about all activism that happened in the early 1970s, a lot of it was through the courts. And the same thing in India. I think most of the pollution activism, including the subsidies or the fines and so on, has come from court activism. I think there's a lot more political awareness now, and so while it's true that the federal government is a different political party, the state government, at least in Delhi and Punjab, is now the same party. The problem is both of them are kind of bankrupt. So, and so I think, again, things that may seem slightly further away, but, are actually important is raising taxes. If the Delhi state government could do a better job with its property tax system, it may actually be in a better position to do something about it. But I think courts have been the main coordinating device right now.
Hi, I have one more question. Sharzad again. I think from the pandemic, something really interesting that I think a lot of us realized was that was a period of sudden economic decline, but it was also a period where we saw the environment recover significantly in such a short period of time. And although that was kind of on accident, we didn't plan for the economy to decline, of course, because of the pandemic. And we also saw a lot of negative impacts on people, especially the lower middle class, who suffered from those economic losses. Do you think that we could actually use that concept in a calculated way to potentially kind of on purpose create maybe limited or less economic growth instead of this sort of having the economy be this infinite engine for growth with kind of no end, in an effort to save our environment?
That is a great question, and as you probably know, there's a large growing movement that pushes for degrowth in rich countries. I think there's a general recognition that this is not a policy that is feasible for lower income countries, but there's certainly a large constituency of people who say that maybe we should push for degrowth in richer countries. I think my own view is it's politically infeasible. There is no politician who's going to win an election saying that I'm going to push for degrowth. What you could do is, push for, I think, kind of policy instruments like taxes or caps, which may have some productivity effects, but are actually aimed at emissions. So I think it's, at least my perspective is we should keep our eye on the ball and really push to reduce emissions. They may have a consequence of reducing economic productivity, and maybe, in richer countries, citizens are going to be willing to take that hit. But I think starting by saying we want to reduce GDP or reduce growth, I think is just politically not going to fly.
Hi, my name is Walter. Thank you very much for that talk. That was really inspiring. And a little bit about myself. I'm doing 4th year econ over here, and I'm really interested in this kind of topic. So I guess my question is that, during the process of international trade, when like Western countries, you see United States, countries in Europe buying goods from East Asia, South Asia, so kind of by this act of international trade and importing goods, they're like outsourcing their pollution to those less developed countries. And is there any way we could try to factor in this kind of externalities, or use some policy to kind of mitigate such effect in a sense?
Yeah, I think it's a very important question, because one thing I didn't mention is that there is actually now increasingly, depressingly as well, a difference if you try to look at this emissions Kuznets curve in terms of emissions and consumption versus emissions and production, right? So in richer countries, you're going to see emissions and production are coming down, but emissions and consumption are not. And that's exactly this outsourcing. And of course, it's completely self-defeating, because a greenhouse gas in the air doesn't matter where it comes from. Unlike air pollution, where you could actually say there was some benefit to the local population from pushing it somewhere else. So there's a much stronger case to prevent it. I think that's what these carbon border adjustment taxes try to do. So these carbon border adjustment taxes say that when you import in goods, the carbon content of that is going to matter. As I said, I think this comes back to our discussion earlier, even also about fossil fuel subsidies. I think for these kind of things to not end up being regressive, they need to be accompanied with some set of global climate financing for these lower income countries that are going to be relying more on this. But I think carbon adjustment taxes are the main thing that people think about as a response to your question.
Thank you.
Hi, hello, over here, on the left.
Oh, okay, great.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Terry. I'm a first-year master's student here in the econ department. I'm wondering, in your research, how many of these firms have you seen have departments or groups that actively are looking to invest in new abatement technology, and if the government provides any incentives to those firms to kind of have a department to look into abatement technology that might improve the carbon emissions of that firm?
That's a great question. I think I haven't seen a lot, but I think there's a lot of this view of, especially for renewables, how do you try to get plants to move away from it? One of the issues for renewable energy is how do you get the grid to work on them? So I think, you can't really, beyond a point, incentivize firms right now to move to solar or wind or these energy types unless we've actually figured out how to get the grid to work to deliver it to them. And that's probably one of the biggest choices that these plants can make, is how do you move away from fossil fuel consumption?
Do you think the government could provide any incentives for these firms to try adopting this technology?
I mean, totally they do, right? I mean, in the US, the Inflation Reduction Act right now is the main one that's doing it both for individuals, but a lot for firms. So for instance, the huge rise we are seeing in investments in electric vehicles in the US is very much because of a response to the IRA policy. The kind of things you come up against in the US, which is there, is that the IRA is providing these subsidies, but what it's not taking account of is what people now say is hitting everyone is how to get permits for land use, right? And so what's really slowing down, so some things are happening, but then I think that's why you need many parts of the regulatory framework to move together. You can't just achieve it by subsidizing investment in firms of a certain kind if these EVs can't actually get land. The other part is, I think this is global, right? So another issue with, if you look at the electric vehicle example of the US, who has got the largest subsidies is actually Ford. Now you might say Ford is not the kind of plant that we think needs these subsidies, but then you could answer and say, well, what they're trying to take on is, say, East Asian manufacturers who are already producing these EVs at scale. And if you don't provide, if in the US you don't see the response coming at scale, you're never going to change the global dynamic of actually increasing overall production, because if other countries want to keep the price of EVs high, they may just cut back production for a while to make sure that price remains high. So I think government subsidies, and we're seeing that with the Inflation Reduction Act, can be important, but I think we really need to think about all the other players and other regulations.
Hi, Jay this side. I'm currently in my second year and studying economics here. So my question was that how has ESG failed so far? Like internal governance should be the first logical step towards a more good climate. But how has ESG failed us?
I'm not going to go into specifics. Actually, an area I'm trying to read upon, I know less than I should, but I would think in terms of incentives. What are the incentives of a firm to really have ESG that works? What are the incentives to just make it look like you have a good ESG and not actually do the work?
Hi, I'm Alice. I'm a math student here. I was just wondering, in the cap system with the plants trading, I was wondering if there's potential for individual plants to try to engage in unnecessary trading in attempts to sort of shift or destabilize the system and shift the economy, the local economy in their favor, and if that has any potential to sort of collapse the system a bit.
So I think the government was very careful in saying that the only traders that can enter right now are the firms who in some sense have a stake in production. But certainly if you look at the US and you look at the regi market, it's trading on the Chicago stock market. Anyone can enter and trade. One of the interesting things we are now seeing is that, for instance, companies like Climate Vault that actually say we will buy permits and then just never trade them again. So in effect, we are going to take on the role of reducing the emissions cap in the market. So you can have those things. Now, are they good or bad? Is it good or bad if someone's willing to pay the market price, and then, it's like Patagonia buying a lot of land and saying we will not do anything with the land, it's just going to be national forests. So I think it's a question on whether you think that behavior should be allowed or not, but it's no obvious reason why that would destabilize.
Hello there. First of all, thank you very much for the lecture. I'm a first-year economics student. My question is, what is a two-paced question? First of all, what would be your plan 10 years down the line when the current cap for emissions is no longer acceptable? And second of all, are you worried that a large corporation or a large company with several smaller facets could simply buy up all of the permits from smaller corporations and then not really have to change their greenhouse gas emissions?
So, the regulator typically always has an ability to change the cap downwards, right? So, in a carbon market, one of the interesting things is what people will call is how long do you set the trade period before you have to true up. Now in carbon, unlike air pollution, you don't have an ability to invest in very fast things to change pollution levels like air filters and scrubbers. You actually genuinely have to change technologies. So you can't have a trading period that's too short because you need to have it be long enough to allow for investments. And you have to be somewhat credible. But given those two constraints, the regulator can always, over time, reduce the overall cap. And that, I think, is one of the advantages of once you've got a market system, there may be less political resistance to that kind of cap reduction than if you have a carbon tax and you're trying to raise it continually. And that, I think, is very visible to people. So I think that's the way in which I think actually bringing down over time emissions caps is going to be easier. Because if you had a first-based carbon tax, we think that the social cost of carbon is going to continue rising over time. So you actually should be continually increasing it over time. I think that's politically hard.
Thank you for the nice talk. I'm a faculty member in engineering. I also teach economics a little bit. Most of the engineers actually don't learn unless they went for, like you said, at least one course they should take. So we try to give more, but we also bring life cycle analysis into it. So my usual start is, microeconomics made it possible for all this cheap stuff, but that's how we also screwed up the world. So I think they get the point that we have to do more than that with the externalities. My question is, right now, I'm just wondering about, like, even Canada and the US, can they quickly come to an agreement? For example, the New York air pollution recently was actually caused by a lot of fire in Canada. Can they solve that quickly?
I don't know, you should tell me. I think you know more about or someone else should tell me, you know more about this issue and how it's working out than I do, actually. So, what do you think? No. Well, that just tells you why it's even harder.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, like, because we don't have a huge differences in economy and so on, and to some extent there is some power imbalance. So if we can't really solve this kind of problem quickly,
Yeah, but you could argue, so right now it's very sporadic. So, you know, you might think these wildfires happened this year in Canada, but they're not really going to happen next year, or it's a fluke. So I think the question is, if it became a very regular occurrence, I suspect you would find more willingness to come to a resolution. I don't know. That would be the hope.
Hi, my name's Aisha. I'm an economics student here, my third year. My question had to do with the standard of emissions that you said that these companies in India were following. They were low enough that they won't hurt the human lungs. So that's fine with humans and everything, but let's say this is all successful. 50 to 60 years down the line, would those low emission amounts build up and perhaps affect the environment and, like, you know, the animals and stuff? Has anyone done research on that? Are they low enough not to hurt humans, but what are the accumulated effect on the environment?
So I think local air pollution, people think disperses after a certain point. So I'm not an expert on this, but I think you're exactly right in thinking about greenhouse gases, right? I mean, we think that that is cumulative. My sense with air pollution, it's a little bit less. So, but I might be wrong. So, but I haven't seen much on it. How are we doing on time, Kate? I realize people's being to leave.
I've just been not paying attention. Questions are awesome.
It's me again, legal studies student. My question is, what are some peaceful and/or convenient ways to make people in higher income levels physically invested in making the environment a better place? Because I noticed you said it took the royal family going to the Great Sink to them to actually implement any sort of restrictive measures for making that place a cleaner body of water.
I mean, I think it's a good question. I mean, I think the pandemic is another example, right? The rate at which the vaccine was discovered for COVID versus, say, malaria, which still does not have a vaccine, I think, again, reflects that who bears the cost makes a big difference. So I don't think, you know, again, maybe awareness, since we don't necessarily want to put people in bad situations, is like, how do you create a lot more information about actually what's happening and what's happening to populations, you know, that are perhaps further away. I think that's one of the big challenges, is a lot of the costs right now, even though they feel terrible, but right now most of it is, you know, it's an Indian summer evening today. It's not what is being faced by a small island country that basically is not going to exist in another few years. And I think it's for your generation to think about how do you actually, I think, bring that sense of universalism in how people think about these issues. I think that's part of it. And that's a trickier problem than the Great Stink problem, because by the time the Great Stink happens in rich countries, it may be very late for a lot of the other world. I think the other way that's going to happen, which I hope not, is, you know, we are seeing a lot more conflict in a lot of these places, right? So one aspect of it that we're seeing already is climate migration. That's hugely increasing. from Sahel, from these countries. It's creating a lot of conflict, especially in, say, Southern Europe and areas like that. Those are not positive ways to create change, but at least it's, I think, bringing in awareness and questions of what does it take to reduce that kind of distress migration.
I guess my final thought is, if we have to wait for people of those levels to be physically invested, like, do we have to wait for the world to be on fire to actually do something about it?
I hope not. Yeah. We can continue over. I'm happy to continue talking also afterwards, yeah. Okay.
So when I lived in Waterloo, my goal was I wanted to plant more trees because I thought that the world needed more trees. And then when I got further into my study, I realized that what I really needed was a better neighborhood because I had lived in this neighborhood that was disconnected. We had cars, we had big, huge houses, we had, you know, everything that everyone expects of a Western country, but we didn't have social cohesion and we didn't have community, and I wanted that in my life, and that would make my life better. So I was wondering, when we're thinking about these global issues, like it's so big, what can we do every day? Like a small ritual that we can do every day that could contribute to seeing some success in some of the studies that you've been doing?
It's a hard question. I mean, one thing I'd encourage you, which I think may seem very trivial, I think is to learn more about what's happening in other parts of the world. I really think if you want to solve this, I think we really need to know about the parts of the world that are burning already. And I think that's something that maybe many of us don't know enough. And it's hard to get that information well. So I think that would be one thing that I would say would be valuable.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Pande, and everyone for those fantastic questions. And I hope we can continue the discussion as we enjoy the reception.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you, everyone.